relevant to the University of Liberia and certainly to our country. So we have a presentation. It will be made by Dr. C. Patrick Burrows. Following that presentation, we will call an array of very highly intellectually knowledgeable panelists to join me on the platform, and then a few of them will participate via Zoom, as Dr. C. Patrick Burrows. Let me briefly introduce Dr. C. Patrick Burrows for your hearing. His name has become a household name recently, but certainly many of us in this hall know of him, have heard of him, perhaps have read some of his publications. Dr. C. Patrick Burrows is a leading Liberian historian. He has served as Vice President for Academic Affairs at Cotton University, Liberia, and Carter G. Woodson Distinguished Professor at Marshall University. Burrows is the author of Between the Kola Forest and the Salty Sea, a history of the Liberia people before 1800 and power and press freedom in Liberia, 1830 to 1970. He is also co-author. He is also co-author the Historical Dictionary of Liberia. His research has received awards from the International Communication Association and the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication. Patrick earned a PhD in communications from Temple University in 1994. Ladies and gentlemen, may you please give Dr. C. Patrick Burrows a round of applause. I was a little confused as to whether he was here or abroad. So Dr. Burrows, good to see you. You got me on that one. Thank you very much. Please.
As much preparation as I had to do for this occasion, the thing that had me very disturbed yesterday, and I was texting a number of contacts at the university, was the protocol. So who do I introduce? I mean, when I start my speech, who do I recognize? And then I noticed earlier that people would say, all protocols observed. So if you will accept that, I do recognize the presence of the president of the university, Dr. Nelson, and Sister Mary Marine, who is on the board of trustees, and all of the other distinguished guests, and to you, fellow citizens of the Republic. President Nelson, let me begin by thanking you for this wonderful historic opportunity. Yeah, not at all.
Mike. 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 Mike.
Like this? Testing. Is that too loud? It's okay? All right. Beautiful. Yeah. Oops, excuse me. Yeah, as I was saying, Dr. Nelson, I'm really honored. It's a historic opportunity for me. Many in the audience don't know this, but my undergraduate experience began at the University of Liberia. But it's more. My academic career as a faculty member and university administrator also at the University of Liberia. And so coming today, you know, in the waning years of my scholarly experience, I'm filled with a lot of memories and very powerful emotions. So bear with me. You know, if anything about my past and my work is known, is that I've been involved in research, lots of research about Liberia. And so since I arrived a few days ago, I've been conducting some research as well. Nothing serious or very formal, a little interviewing here and there. And what I've learned, quite interesting, is that for a lot of Liberian parents today, they tell me there are 4 types of children in the country. 1, the very best kids, the smart ones, who go into politics. You have those children who are a little less than bright, and they go to law school and they become lawyers. And then there are the okay students or children of the parents who go into accounting and finance. And then the 4th set of children are the stupid ones who go into history and the humanities. And so, from talking to some of these parents, I learned that I'm one of the stupid children, right? Because I've gone in that area. Now, as you can imagine, I don't agree with these parents. I happen to think very highly of education in history and the humanities. And I hope to make that case to you in the course of our discussions here today. You see, the importance of history and humanities is that they provide us with critical answers. Answers to the question of who are we, where are we coming from, in order that we can know where we are headed. And for that reason, I think, we ought to pay greater attention to those fields of study that are the only ones that can provide us with those answers. Before I begin my formal presentation, I would like to engage you in an evocation. And it is the stone that the builders refused shall be the first cornerstone. I know the hall is big and we are scattered, Maybe you didn't hear me. I'll say it again. The stone that the builders refused shall be the first cornerstone. Amen? All right. Now, this expression, this idea, is available in a variety of cultures, in a variety of ways. The Bible say, the rope or the twine that you ignore will be the one that's used to tie you. So the question is, they're asking, so what is this cornerstone or rope that I'm alluding to? And what I would suggest is that for us, it is history. We try to go this way, we try to go that way, we try to go under it, but we won't go through. And hopefully today we can engage in some of that conversation. I would like to try and address one small part of the question, the puzzle. And the talk that I want to present is a fresh perspective on Liberia's founding. A fresh perspective. If I'm saying that we need a fresh perspective, that means we already have a perspective. But for some reason or other, we need to upgrade, to update. And that's the point I want to make. Our 200-year journey together as a people began as a very dramatic international affair. So I want to recount that story. And the way I want to do it is a little different. Instead of dragging it, we get to the conclusion, I will give you the conclusion first, and then I'll tell you how I got to that conclusion. Fair enough? All right. So the characters involved in this story included two noted Americans, one being Captain Robert F. Stockton of the U.S. Navy. Now, the U.S. Congress had approved money for the settlement of Africans who were taken from aboard slave ships to be settled somewhere in Africa, but they had not secured a place. So Stockton was there to represent those interests. And then the other American who is noted is Dr. Eli Ayres, who was representing the American Colonization Society. So they are working together. They arrived, they meet in Freetown. From Freetown, they travel to Cape Messerado. Cape Messerado had been the most recommended place to them to pursue for a colony. And so they arrived. Now they arrived at a time when the highest ranking African ruler in the Cape Messerado area was Tawe Peter. Tawe being the title in Day. And so when they landed from their boat, they immediately said, we would like to acquire some land here, a tract of land for this purpose, but we want to talk to the landholder. And everybody who had gathered around them said, oh, you need to talk to Tawe Peter. And that's how the process began. There were other local rulers who became involved in the negotiations, but none was as senior as he. The discussions that took place among them were recorded by Dr. Ayres. And he recorded them as if a diary or a journal. Every day he was writing, today this is what happened. The next day, today, the date, this is what happened. And so it unfolded. His account is the most accurate, detailed account that we have. Because, you see, historians believe that if someone is writing about an event years later, they can change some of the facts. Maybe the memory is not so good, or they may alter the facts to suit themselves, and they want to puff themselves up. But the best account that you can get, the most reliable, is the one that is from that moment, in the moment the person is recording. And that was what he was doing. And then when the negotiations were over, he packed the letter and sent it to the ACS and said this is what had transpired. For 200 years, the negotiations for land at Cape Mesurado have been enshrouded in myths. And by myths, I don't mean like the legends that people tell about their past, sometimes involving supernatural forces and such. That's one meaning of myth. What I'm talking about here are half-truths, ELDC, or lie history, to put it like that. And these myths have stood in the way of us understanding this very important story. So in order to get to the bottom of the story, I had to be able to put those myths aside, to cut a path, if you will, through the weed. The second thing beyond cutting the myths was to understand how ethnicity and power were operating on the Windward Coast at that time, particularly in the area of Cape Mesurado. And then the third was to understand something that most of us have not come to appreciate. Some of us know and accept that, yes, Africans were engaged in the slave trade for hundreds of years. And it's caused great devastation to the continent. When the Ghanaians had their year of return a few years ago, it was based on their acceptance of that history and their willingness to transcend it. I'd say most of us accept that the slave trade took place. Some of us still, we are in denial. But it did. But here's the thing. Most of us do not accept that Africans were also abolitionists. When you say abolition, people automatically think, oh, there were these great British philanthropists. Oh, there were these New England clerics. But the first abolitionists were Africans who refused to accept this traffic in human beings. And they opposed it. So in addition to using the account of Dr. Ayers, over the years, I've learned where the oral traditions of our people have been recorded and to employ those oral traditions as well. So, according to oral traditions, and I refer you to the Cola book which was mentioned, the Dey were the first to settle in this region. Their oral tradition says it, and then other people's oral history say when we came, we met the Dey here. The Dey came down the St. Paul, they hit the coast, and then they branched going westward, all the way to Kipmouth. Clay, Bomi, which we now take to be Gola territory, originally the Dey were there. Their salt making, boiling seawater to make salt, attracted people from the empires in the Sahel to try and find the source of this salt. So the ancestors of the Vai came and settled among the Dey. When the Gola were put under pressure from up north in their original homeland in the Kumba Mountains, they moved south. They took refuge among the Dey. Today, there are very few Dey speakers in Liberia. We have Dey Gola, we have Dey Vai combinations, and many Dey and the repatriates who came from the U.S. also intermarried. but that they were here. So it's not a surprise that Tawet Peter was the person who then everybody said, oh, you need to go talk to him. He's the landholder. So on December 6th, Stockton airs about 15 other Americans, some U.S. sailors, some black repatriates, travel from Freetown to the area of Cape Mesurado. And the negotiations began. Now, I'll cut the story short in the interest of time. But suffice it to say, initially, negotiations were going favorably. And mainly 2 people appeared from Freetown. I don't say this as, please, sometimes you take these things as, oh, this is a statement about everybody from Freetown. No, that's not what I'm saying. Freetown was the most cosmopolitan, developed town on the coast of West Africa in many ways. They had some of everything going on there. Repairing ships from all over the world, what have you, British naval ships and so on. You had abolitionists there, and you had slave traffickers. So the 2 people who came to intervene in the negotiations were opposed to the abolition of the slave trade. One man said he was working on a ship, a slave ship, and Stockton had attacked their ship simply because they were involved in the slave trade. He spoke. And then there was a biracial trader who was involved in the kidnapping and selling of Africans. And he spoke at length, saying, don't give these people this land. They are against the slave trade. They come here, they will put us. Stockton, at that point, pulled out these pistols he kept in the back of his trousers. And he gave one to Ayers. And he says, if this man keeps talking, shoot him. And he took the other pistol out and demanded to be allowed to speak. By that time, the rulers from the different sections of Cape Mesurado were gathered. They were in the conference negotiating. So they said, and he explains, yes, I attacked that ship, but it wasn't because they were in the slave trade. I can't attack any non-American ship. It was a French ship. But I attacked them because they attacked me first. And then he goes on with his explanation. He finished. The rulers say, okay, y'all go. We'll hang head. And they decide. And they said, okay, we'll give you the land. We're talking a tract of land where Central Monrovia is located. Today, a lot of us want to look backwards from where we are, and we say, oh, they sold the whole Liberia. No. One tract of land. Few years later, a woman who was the proprietor, it was said, of half of Bushrat Island, sold that tract to the colony of Liberia. Caldwell, the land for Caldwell, would be sold by 5 of the 6 rulers who had been involved in that original purchase agreement. And those 5, sold other tracts for specific towns over a few years later. So when people say that Liberia was purchased at gunpoint, it is not accurate. Stockton was not holding his gun at anybody's head and said, sign this paper or else. He pulled the gun in order to be given a chance to speak. And after he was done speaking, the chiefs dismissed them and they made a decision. Not only that, the contract was not signed until the next day, and when it was signed, they implemented the agreement. So the question is, how do we find ourselves in the place where we have allowed that story to become so clouded? One, there's an assumption, And you know what it's saying in Liberia by assuming things, right? That people living in Cape Masurado area were untouched by what was going on in the rest of the world. And it's just not true. The first Portuguese came in the mid-1400s, right? Pedro de Centra. One of the things that used to bother me when the Cola Forest book was first published, people would come around, pick up the book, and they would say to me, "You have Pedro de Centra in this book, right?" And I'd say, "Yeah." It was as if you don't put a Portuguese explorer in a book, it's not legitimate. They didn't ask me, "Did you use Cola oral history? Did you use..." No. Pedro de Centra, his name is in the book. Okay. So Pedro de Centra came in the 1400s. But do you know what? By 200 years later, 1650, here is what the lifestyle was on the coast, the Windward Coast. People were drinking French brandy, Caribbean rum, eating smoked herring from the Mediterranean with salted codfish from Norway. They were using Danish muskets to hunt. And when Ayres and Stockton were here for the negotiations, there were an estimated 60 or 80 men with muskets in the crowd. So food, the diet, had been affected by this back and forth interchange. Cassava is originally from Brazil. By 1650, it was incorporated into our diet, both in the form of cassava leaf and gumbo, which is uniquely Liberian. Fufu is all over the region we know. Both of them derived from cassava. The clothes that we were wearing, the print, the wax print that we said a Fanti cloth, at that time was being produced in Java, in Asia. Our people were not isolates, as some anthropologists have presented. They were cosmopolitans. Now, it was not a one-way thing that they were just here sitting down here, "Oh, you got small fish." It's not that. What drew the Portuguese to this area was the fact that our ancestors were selling salt up north. They were selling cola seeds internationally, and Malagueta pepper, which was being sold in Spain and in Italy by 1100 AD. They came looking for the source of the Malagueta. So it was that back and forth trading that made those changes. So there are other little myths that, have come to be accepted, and I would like to discuss a few of them and then move from there. Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to skip certain portions so in the interest of time. Yeah, so one of the assumptions that we make is that why did people, Ayres and others, refer to the ruler living on Bushrod Island, whose grave is now erroneously assigned to Zulu Duma. Zulu Duma did not live on Bushrod Island. When we do know history, these are the complications we get ourselves in. Can you imagine? So the assumption is the Americans came, they didn't bother to learn the people's names, they just started writing down any kind of name they wanted. Oh, your name is Peter. Oh, your name is George. No. From 1600, people here, especially rulers, often had a European or Western name, sometimes exclusively, but oftentimes both a Western name, outward facing, and then an indigenous name. For Tawel Peter on Butcher Island, I have seen no record of his indigenous name. Whenever he was mentioned or he introduced himself, it was as Peter. And the name Peter had been used by many rulers along the Windward Coast. So he was not the first. One of the reasons people confuse him with Zoloduma is because Zoloduma also used the name Peter Careful. But they were not the same. So that's one error that we enter into. So when you have people coming from America and they have English names, you have people on the ground here, some of whom had English names. I can show you the records of slave ships who were carrying captives from the Windward Coast. They got stopped. They dropped the people off in Freetown. And when they were getting off the British anti-slavery boats, and people said, "What's your name?" And the children, 12-year-old, "My name is William." I'm not saying those are the only names, but those names are very valuable. They are in the course if you're, skeptical or you are interested in more, because they give you sometimes the ethnic origins of the people who were on those ships. Names like Talo, etc. The other assumption people make is somehow, our rulers around Cape Mesurado were duped. They didn't know. The people took advantage. You're cheating Africans of our humanity and our intelligence. People have been negotiating international contracts for centuries. Some Dutch ship captain comes, he says, I'm coming back, I want a ton of Malagueta pepper next year. You can arrange it for me? Of course. What price are you going to pay me? And then the deal is followed up on. And so we have these assumptions that have impeded, our understanding. Another assumption. The people didn't understand what the people were talking, the American people were talking. How could they? But you see, when we assume that our people were isolates, some anthropologists say, hunters and gatherers, then all these other unfounded assumptions follow. But the reality is that when they landed and they asked for the main ruler in the area, his assistant spoke English to them. When Salvoso came down to negotiate, he got involved in the conferencing and so forth. He was invited. He spoke English. He had served on a British ship. For how many centuries men from the Crew Coast have been working on Western ships? People living here spoke Dutch, French, and English. As for Portuguese, just leave that one. Portuguese is embedded in several indigenous languages of Liberia. But you wouldn't know. The word that we use for certain objects that were introduced when the Portuguese came in the language is based on a Portuguese word. The word palavra that we use so often for so many things, palavra sauce, it's a Portuguese word. That's the kind of thing where it led the former dictator of Zaire, Mobutu Sese Seko, to rename the country from the Congo. He gave the name Zaire, only to find out that Zaire was not a local name. Because we don't take the time to understand our history and the flow of it. We make these unfounded assumptions. But here's the top point regarding language and English. Throughout the negotiations, the rulers of the region were served by an interpreter and a scribe who lived on what is now Providence Island. His name was John Mill. His father was British. His mother was African. Mill had spent 10 years in Liverpool being educated. Came to Providence Island. Why? Because that island had been held by slave traders, European slave traders, for years. His father had a trading business there. He told his son, go take it over. But the boy had been exposed when he was going to Liverpool. He saw the conditions of slaves in America and in the Caribbean. And it was burning him. And 1 year before Stockton and others came, he said, I'll take my hand in this business. The money is good, but it's not worth it. And so here he was on Providence Island, the last of the notorious slave traders. And the Americans arrived. He is the scribe for the rulers, and he's translating fluent English. So those are some of the obstacles that kept people from seeing what was really happening on the ground in those negotiations. And once I was able to remove those scales from my eyes, I could then begin to see some patterns. Another one of those scales I will mention, the myths. Only men make history in Liberia. You talk about the past, they say, oh, the kings and the warriors, the kings and the warriors. In this little drama of 1821, 1822, I can't tell you the number of women who were involved. There was a woman who was the ruler of Bali Island. And she died just before the Americans arrived. She was replaced by one of her dependents. He was involved during the negotiations. So had she not died, she probably would have been involved. Then there was a woman who owned part of Busher Island who later sold it. And beyond that, according to day oral history, while all this talking was going on among men, there was the matron of the Sandy Society who was in the background arranging for this contract to be worked out. Her brothers, several of her brothers, were rulers among the day. And that they say this now. It's a matter of documents, oral traditions, all of these various types of evidence put together to get our story. See, unfortunately, we have been missing our story. We have refused the stone. We have ignored the rope. And now it is catching up with us. As an African people, I mean, for anybody, anywhere in the world, but especially in Africa, for you to dishonor your ancestors is a serious thing. For you to not take them seriously and credit them, woe unto you. And that's how we have been moving. So we can put my name here, not a grave, but what, so what? Daddy the other grave, so what? And that's how we're going. But I can tell you that some of the earliest graves in the world exist in West Africa. And when I say graves, I don't mean people just take their body and drop them somewhere. Cut the graves, put the bodies, they put flowers, put jewelry. Thousands of years ago, we were treating our ancestors with respect. And part of the respect is telling their story appropriately. We want to substitute our judgment for theirs. If I were there, I wouldn't have made that decision. A stupid man. are you? Oh, the pastor was sold the land for smoked fish. So, smoked fish was like caviar back then. Are we not consuming foreign liquor and foreign foods today? But we condescendingly, sometimes we make these kinds of references. So after 200 years, I think it's past time for us to broaden the lens. The ACS made contributions of resources, yes. The U.S. Navy did, yes. But they did not provide the blood, sweat, and tears that cement a nation blocks together. That's what our ancestors did. And I mean by that, repatriates, African abolitionists, recaptures from slave ships. They were the first generation of Liberians. And you know something? That group was the first to end the slave trade on the coast of West Africa. Are you hearing me? The first. The British anti-slavery squadron was based in Freetown, but it's one thing to have sailors on a ship going pursuing slave ships, important work, but they were not on the ground. But our people were on the ground. And they systematically went and stopped the traffic from along this coast. Do we give them the credit? No. We sit down, other nations are patting themselves, but we walk around, oh, so shame. All the old people, they were not together, they didn't know what they were doing. So that is who we are. That's the answer I want to share. That is where we have been. That first generation is the cornerstone that we have been refusing. They are the rope that we have sought to ignore. And now it's got us tied. May an appreciation of their actions and their motives inform us as we journey forward. Thank you. One more, please. Thank you. Hello? Okay.
Please, control room, please put the mics on. We're about to get into serious discussion, control room. Please put the mics on.
Okay. Mine's on. Ladies and gentlemen, please give Dr. C.
Give the
Patrick
stage
Burroughs
mic, please.
another round of applause as we, yes, as we are about to make a transition into our panel discussion. I think my mic is off now. Okay, good. Okay. Dr. Burroughs, is your mic still on? Good. Okay, you've heard the delivery, very riveting, very revealing. He's challenging some of the assumptions, long-held assumptions that have sort of defined a narrative that Burroughs that has predominantly been told, conveyed. And so we will certainly get into serious discussion now. Let me announce the panelists that we've put together for this very important discussion. And as I read your bow, please come forward and sit on the panel if you're in Liberia. And if you are not in Liberia, please acknowledge, by saying something outside. Our first panelist is William Ezra Allen. He's a professor of history at the University of Liberia. He is recipient of the Rockefeller Foundation African Institution Internship Award and the Fulbright Fellowship. His publications include Liberia and the Atlantic World, Convergence and Effects. 2, Making History, I like this one, Making History in the Bedroom, American Liberians and Indigenous Liberians' Sexual Unions, 1880s to 1950s. He held faculty positions in the U.S., including at Kennesaw State University, Atlanta, Georgia. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on the platform Dr. William Allen. Okay, let me also now go via online to introduce Dr. George Clay Kier Jr., who is currently Dean of the Barbara Jordan McKee Leland School of Public Affairs and Professor of Political Science at Texas Southern University and Professor of International Relations Graduate School here at the African Methodist Episcopal University in Liberia. You can sit right here. I want you to be close to Dr. Boris here. Dr. Kier has published extensively on issues pertaining to Liberia. His most recent book on Liberia is an edited volume under the title Liberia in the 21st Century, Issues and Perspectives. Do we have Dr. George Clay Kier Jr. on Zoom? Can you unmute Dr. so that we can hear him? He's not on yet. All right, we'll move on. Our next panelist is very familiar to all of us in this room. He is Dr. D. Ebu Don. He's the Alfred Walter Nigley Professor of Political Science Emeritus, Samuel C. Winey, the University of the South. He was the last Minister of State for Presidential Affairs to the late President William R. Tolbert Jr. Please welcome Professor Dr. Ebu Don. While Dr. Don is coming, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Herbert Brewer, who is the coordinator of the African American and African Diaspora Studies Program and assistant professor of history at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. Professor Brewer specializes in the history of slavery, and you can sit on the last. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. In Baltimore, Maryland, and in history, Professor Brewer specializes in the history of slavery and emancipation in the Atlantic world and was a 2017-2018 Mellon Fellow for the Study of Slavery at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and was the first Lord Baltimore Fellow at the Maryland Historical Society. His current research focus is the intellectual history of the African American diaspora in the 18th and 19th century Atlantic world. He is a co-author of Guide to the History of Slavery in Maryland. The Brewer's work has also appeared among other places in the African American Historical Review. He is currently writing a new biography of Joseph Jenkins Roberts, Liberia's first president and founding president of Liberia College. Brewer received the Diploma Institut de Linguistique Française from the Université de Poitiers, France, and his PhD in history from the University of Maryland College Park. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife and their son. Please give him a hand of applause as he acknowledges his presence. Dr. Brewer, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Last but not the least, very important panelists as well, ladies and gentlemen. Cassandra Martisium is Genome Group Research Leader for the interdisciplinary project, African Knowledges and the History of Publication, at the African Multiple Cluster of Excellence, University of Beirut. Before that, she lectured at the University of Passau. She is also a former Marie Him Vauquelin Research Fellow, Swiss National Science Foundation. She's already coming. She recently co-edited the volume, The Politics of Historical Memory and Commemoration in Africa 2020. She is the author of Mediators, Contract Men and Colonial Capital, Mackinac Gold Mining in the Gold Coast Colony, 1879 to 1909, published by the University of Rochester Press in 2018. She has written chapters and articles on Liberia's diplomatic, economic, and cultural history. So please give her a hand. Okay, so we have one more panelist. His name is Mr. Aaron Weir. We don't have a formal short bio of him. I know him very well. He used to be here in Liberia. He's doing his PhD in the UK. He's a historian in making. He's very knowledgeable about Liberia's political history. So, Mr. Weir, please acknowledge your presence here. There you go. Please give Mr. Weir. Thank you very much. Okay, folks. Yes, good. So this is the panelists we have put together for you. Unfortunately, we should have had Councillor T. Nibali Warner, Dean of the Louis Arthur Graham School of Law, should have been on this panel, but he had a family situation that has prevented him from coming. However, we do have in this audience lawyers who would definitely be called upon, if necessary, to chime in on the discussion. So let's go into the discussion. The way we're going to proceed with the discussion is as follows. The panelists will have 3 to 5 minutes or so to respond essentially to the presentation, disagree, agree, critically look at it, and then we'll turn the floor over to you, the audience, to chime in with your questions or comments or whatever. We'll take it through at a time. We got 2 marks already positioned for that, and then you can throw questions to Dr. Burrows or Dr. Brewer or Dr. Burrows or the panelists here or online. Okay? So let's go, ladies and gentlemen. Give our panelists a big hand of applause. Very good. Now, serious business. Let me start with the presenter. You started off by saying you want to demystify the myth that has somehow found its way into the narrative, beclouding, a degree of accuracy, distorting some of the facts. So you're on the mission. And I'd like to know from you, how well are you faring on that mission? Do you feel now you're making progress, or the myth still persists from your perspective? Put it all the way to the end. Okay, why he's can everybody touch the mic just in case,
Testing.
Oh, testing. No.
Hello? Okay.
So, what I would say is that this work didn't start the work of debunking the myths in history. It didn't start with the article book Between the Polar Forest and the Salty Sea. You'll see that in the introduction, I am challenging Liberian readers to understand that there are certain words and ways of looking at themselves that are backing up to understand our story. And it has been this way for a while. Thank you. Hello? I'll cut this off and hopefully now. Better? Oh, thanks. Okay. Yeah, so I'll be quick. What I was saying is that if you look at the book Between the Polar Forest and the Salty Sea, introduction, what I've tried to do is to outline to Liberian readers that we have to tackle some understanding of our past that are blocking us from a full appreciation. Take, for example, Geese first arrived. They kept the ritual masquerade dancers as that were not all of us, but many. We haven't stopped and said, where does these words come from? More than where they come from, how do they affect the way we appreciate or don't our culture, our traditions, religion, and how can you respect the culture they embody? So these myths are powerful. And it's been a journey of many years of trying to confront them. Because I realize that if I don't really get at the real history of this region.
Okay, so confronting the inevitability of these myths, which are so powerful, is a task that certainly rests with Dr. Burroughs, but certainly with all of us in Liberia as well. Let me bring in Dr. Edward Dawn. You seated far on the left. You are a renowned historian. You listened to the eloquent presentation of Dr. Burroughs. Dr. Burroughs. I don't, for some reason, Dr. Burroughs will soon come in. I get stuck in my head. Okay.
Hello.
Okay, so what I think we'll do, you come here, you know, do your 2 to 3 minute stuff, and then we'll go on from there, because this mic seems to be working better than the movable mic.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. I would like to make 2 brief comments preliminarily. The first comment is to pick up on what Dr. Burroughs started to say about myth. I think that he is leading us on a different path from the path that we have followed in the past in terms of studying our past, the Liberian past. I was editor for the Liberian Studies Journal for about 10 years between 1985 and 1995. And I remember processing an article that was done by Dr. Burroughs on our founding constitution, that is the Constitution of 1847, of 1848. And one of the things that stood out in that article was who wrote the Constitution of 1847. And I'm sure many of you here went through the school systems in this country, and the name Simon Greenleaf stands out as the guy who wrote the Constitution. Well, we have come to learn since then that Greenleaf made some contributions, but there were people on the ground here, leaders of Liberia on the ground here, who actually did the writing of the Constitution. So I think that's part of, at another level, the sort of thing that Burroughs is challenging us to begin to do. The other thing I like to do is to make a general comment on the state of Liberian studies or Liberian history. You know, since the end of the Second World War, around the time when President Tubman came to power, we had a number of Liberians going abroad to study, do graduate work, master's degree, PhD degrees, and so forth. And as I recall, a lot of the people who came back with master's degrees, doctorate degrees, ended up as government bureaucrats. I can even remember some of the names. Probably some in the audience will remember the name of John Payne Mitchell, who went to the University of Chicago, one of the leading schools in the United States, and came back here in 1955 with a PhD degree. And he became a government bureaucrat and remained in that capacity for the rest of his life. There are a number of others I could cite as examples. I'm reminded as I talk about this thing sometimes of a French sociologist called Roland, who says that troubled times incite reflection. Maybe as a consequence of the quote-unquote rights riots of 1979, or as a consequence of the coup d'etat of 1980, or as a consequence of the 15 years of civil war, something has begun to happen to us as a people. We have decided, I believe, to pause. And I say pause and begin to look at some of the studies that Burroughs alluded to. We have a number of studies done by anthropologists and people in other disciplines. The cumulative effect of all of those studies is that they have tended to define us as a people in a certain way. Since all these times of troubles, we have seen a number of Liberians stand up and begin to raise questions, critical questions, about the validity of some of these studies that have been written, designed to define us. You know, I think it was back in the 1960s that a group of Africans group of African historians, I should actually say, coming out of the colonial experience, began to raise questions about the interpretation that was brought to Nigerian history and Ghanaian history and West African history on the part of colonial scholars. And as a consequence of their work, we have a multi-volume production of the history of Africa spearheaded by UNESCO. I think it is that kind of thing that I hope Dr. Burroughs' studies will stimulate among people who research and write on Liberia. I like to stop on that.
Yeah, can you stand for a moment, please? Hello? One of the important sources of historical transmission is oral history. And we are talking about a period 200 years ago, 1822 or just about. The assumption that Dr. Burroughs seems to be making is that some of the oral history that was passed down from generation to generation relative to the purchase of land, etc., may not have been accurate. Is that something, is there a case to be made that, we're discounting some of the oral history and now emphasizing the written history as was told by people like Eli Aries and Robert Stockton?
Well, I think it's a combination. I don't think it's either or. When you're doing research, you look at many sources, not one source. You do interviews, you look at the oral history, you go to the archive, you look at the written record, and you make some judgment. Understand that that's part of the thinking too. You make some judgment about what it is that you are looking at. And let me just make this point before I take my seat. Knowledge acquisition is an ongoing process. We never know everything. So when we say something based on our research and our judgment at that point in time, at one level I like to say that we should take it as tentative. That's the state of knowledge now. 15, 20, 50 years from now, fresh evidence may emerge and lead us to re-examine what we are concluding on today.
Thank you very much. Good. Let's go now to Zoom. Dr. heard the presentation by Dr. Burrows, you've heard the response from Dr. Involved in the African American history in the diaspora. Is this something that strikes? Is it agreeable to what Dr. Burrows has said or Dr. Down has said, or you seem to flow along?
Was that question directed to me, and can you hear me first of all?
Yes, we can hear you out. Just essentially your response to what the main speaker said and the response from Dr. Ebudon relative to historical interpretation and the possibility of it being distorted, one way or the other.
Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for inviting me to join you in making these, in marking these important milestones in both the nation's and the university's history. Dr. Burrows' rediscovery copy of what some people call the Thief of Monrovia undoubtedly is a historic document. It is. It's a significant and in many ways a central piece of that story, that larger story. But among other things, this moment and what he discovered to revisit and re-examine his history. So I'd like to take. So in keeping in the spirit of Dr. Burrows' intervention, what I want to do, 5 minutes, is take advantage of this occasion to share with you snippets from a speech by Joseph Jenkins Roberts, the first president of Liberia College and the first president of Liberia. In a way, I might say this is an opportunity to introduce Liberia. Now, on Wednesday, August 6th, 1845, in Monrovia, the then governor gave a lecture to the Liberia Lyceum. So this Lyceum was waited, where lectures were held to discuss issues of the day. In the lead up to the Liberian national independence, debates were being held on the pros and cons of independence. Not everybody was for independence. And in this talk that evening, his talk, Roberts proposed to advance what Roberts said, and I'm quoting him here, a few thoughts on the subject of the mental capacities of the African race compared with the Caucasian race, unquote. Roberts went on, and I quote him again. He said, Mr. Chair, the African race is but a little removed from the group creation, only an intermediate link between the man and the orangutan, and not to attain the same powers of intellect with which the West is endowed. Now, sir, I'm continuing to quote Roberts, it is difficult to say whether this palpably incorrect and wantonly insulting excites more contempt by its falsehood and absurdity than surprise in coming from one who connected himself so closely with the race he attempts to degrade. It is not from any desire to revive past unpleasant feelings respecting color that I now address it. I rejoice in common with my fellow citizens that we are happily removed from that state which gave birth to such feelings so unbecoming and enlightened and Christian people. Unquote. And I'm putting here the heavy. Roberts is referring actually to Thomas Jefferson. Roberts explained why he had chosen to speak on the topic of racism that day. Quoting him here, my objective, therefore, sir, in selecting this topic is to enlighten and to vindicate the African race from the most unfounded and scandalous reflection. In that sentence, we may find, I think, one of the animating principles behind the founding of Liberia, to vindicate Africa from, as Robert said, a most unfounded and scandalous reflection. So the idea of redemption, of restoration, of recovery, reclamation, revitalization, an idea that would later echo in the 19th and 20th centuries in the thought of Pan-Africanism, from Blyden to Garvey, from Du Bois to Nkrumah. Roberts was a trailblazer. J.D. Roberts argued that no matter how you analyze the thing, whether through the lens of revelation or through the lens of reason, one was bound to come to the same conclusion about the fundamental equality of all humans. But Roberts continued, excuse me, no man, I presume, I'm quoting him again, no man, I presume, will deny that Africans are moral agents. then if moral agents, they must be capable of intelligence. And if so, then they are capable of education. 4, to imagine beings possessed of intellectual powers not quite capable of intelligence is certainly, in my opinion, a contradiction of terms, which cannot be reconciled. So Roberts goes on later in that same lecture to discuss ancient Egyptian civilization. And he anticipates, for example, the great Senegalese scholar, Sheikh Anta Diop. For Roberts, the accomplishments of ancient Egypt, as well as various African empires and kingdoms, were an inspiration, proof of African genius and capacity and achievement. Roberts also reminded his audience of the role Africans played in the formation of the early Christian church and of the numerous intellectual contributions Black people have made throughout history. In examining Roberts' thought, we should see him as a 19th century trailblazer, an embryonic Pan-Africanist, though I will admit that this is not how Liberians typically view the country's history. The simplistic and one-dimensional way he is portrayed is not his fault, though. So let us see, I think, use this moment in our history as an opportunity to also reflect upon and reassess the complex intellectual legacies left behind by men like Roberts, but not only Roberts. Of course, he was, as I said before, the founding president of Liberia College. I want to quickly just conclude these brief remarks, not just to thank you once again, but also by recognizing Dr. Hannah Abiru-Bowen-Jones for paving the way. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Please give him a big hand of applause. So, Cassandra, it's your turn. You do research on African knowledges. What do you think? Listening to Dr. Buro and Burroughs, why our knowledges, our information, are so de-emphasized? I mean, why is that the case that the world doesn't recognize the extent of our knowledge? Is that something we're not doing, responsible for that perception? Okay. You can add that as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be speaking here today. It's quite an honor. I made some general remarks that may connect to your question, so I'll read them, then I'll connect directly to your. So I'm a historian who's very much interested in the place of power when it comes to producing history, and not just written history, but different forms of history as well. And so I wrote these few words. Liberian history is a treasure trove of written, recorded, oral material and archaeological artifacts. It's a treasure trove for those who are curious enough to seek out and critically analyze the evidence. For those open to learning, even if that learning, that process of learning really forces us or them into new and more complex realms of social, and national understanding. This broad body of knowledge comprising of these different material, oral history, memory, and a long paper trail in the Liberian case is particularly rare, and I think we forget this a lot. It's very rare to have this combination when we look across the African continent and even at other Black-led states. So let us not approach this knowledge in an abstract and unsophisticated manner. I think let us not only refer to it to support temporary, always temporary partisan politics. In fact, let us use this wealth of historical insight to change ourselves. Let it speak to those of us who have open minds. And that brings with it a lot of vulnerability as well. So today we talk about one type of historical source. Of course, Dr. Barrow has worked with lots of different other forms of historical sources, so not let us forget that. And yet, I think this historical discovery reminds us that we're never done learning. So this isn't the end of Liberia's story. We're never done learning about the past. Liberian history is a treasure trove. Excuse me. So this handwritten agreement is just the latest, not the last, but the latest discovery from this rich archive. Let it inspire critical and constructive debate and reflection about Liberia's past, but also Liberia's future. Let it inspire future generations of treasure hunters, and let it not be the last gem. So as we celebrate the University of Liberia, take this moment and let it drive, take the momentum with you and let it drive the current moment. So let us not simplify this knowledge to fit certain molds, to answer the question a bit more directly. Let us open ourselves up to dealing with complexity. Let us not assume that we know answers before we do the research, before we interrogate the material. And I think I'll end with that. I hope it answered your question.
Thank you. Very profound, very moving. Liberia's history is a treasure trove. And so we have to confront this treasure trove with an open mind. Let us not make assumptions before we confront that. One of the men that has been confronting Liberia's history over the last several years is Professor Dr. Roland Ezra Ali. Professor Ali, so excited to have that microphone is awaiting you. So please take charge.
Let me thank Dr. Burrows for his presentation. And I want to make a couple of points to sort of how we can look at the history of Liberia. Dr. Burrows mentioned that on the Liberian coast, you had Liberians who had learned to speak European languages. It's indeed true. He mentioned the word palava, where it comes from the Portuguese word, which means to talk. That's the meaning, and the reason why they used that word palava here was that when the Portuguese came, they usually bargained with the indigenous people for a long time, establishing price for captives, price for pepper, and so forth. So the Portuguese brought this word in palava, which means to talk, a lot of talk. There were also other Portuguese words. For example, dash. Those of you who grew up in my generation, you heard dash. Dash me. That word comes from the Dutch also, that you had the Dutch on the coast. So you don't only have the Portuguese, you had the Dutch, the English, and so forth. In places like the coast of Ghana, where the English were well entrenched by the 1800s, the indigenous people who speak English on the Liberian coast, because you didn't have one European language, you had different people speaking. So we have Dutch, you have Palava, and so forth along the coast. Also, the exchange that he talked about, our peppers going to Europe, and so forth, and the Europeans bringing in their textile, their guns, and so forth. Indeed, Africans were also sending things out. The okra we eat, the okra came from Africa, that we eat in the United States now. So the Europeans brought the cassava here, they also took okra. I say all of this to indicate that historical research is still relatively new in Liberia, relatively new. So, but when a discovery is made, what scholars and academics usually do is that the discoverer brings the discovered, what has been discovered. And that discovered material, the question you raise first is, what knowledge does it add to our existing knowledge? Does it add knowledge to it? This is where I want to thank Dr. Burrows, because Dr. Burrows discovered the deed for Liberia. In fact, the topic of this for this discussion was the deed for Monrovia. He discovered that deed. And when he discovered the deed, the information was posted on the Washington Post. So we were excited, because the question is, this is a very important historical document, but in addition, what does it add to our knowledge of Liberian history? Does it bring anything new to the history? And this is again where we need to thank Dr. Burroughs, because he mentioned that there are several myths in Liberian history. There are several things that we have been teaching our children that is ill-informed, several myths. So the question becomes, what new knowledge in this document, what informed us now to say what was being said here all along is incorrect? What's in this new document? Because we have to find out, where is this source of knowledge? What's in this new document? For example, he talked about the gun that Stockton used. Now, in the history books, the various history books, it says that Robert Stockton took a gun and brandished it in front of the indigenous people, and because of that threat, the people signed the deed. Well, I was glad when I heard that Dr. Burroughs had discovered this deed. So the question I will have is, what's in that deed or this new information that allows us to throw away the information we have or to discard this information? Why is this source of this new knowledge? If we have the new knowledge, what does it add to us for us to understand? There were several other myths he talked about. Now, there are several sources of history. You have oral tradition, you have documentary evidence, there is anthropological evidence. There are several sources. So, what my question here is that as we search for knowledge, our history is rich. My research I'm doing, I'm finding things that Dr. Burroughs and others are finding, Dr. Dunn and others have found. But we have to base our presentation on what we have found. What new knowledge do we have that shares? So if you say we debunked this myth, where is the evidence that we debunked the myth? And in my conclusion, I would just mention that the ACS published a deed. A copy of the deed is in the Library of Congress. And that deed is what scholars have used all along. The ACS set up a committee in 1833 to find the original deed. And our committee said that it could not trace the deed, but it had a duplicate deed, apparently copied from the original. And that's the original that Dr. Burroughs, other scholars have been using. So the question I'm raising is, in the interest of establishing the facts, what is the difference between the deed that we have been using all along and this deed that Dr. Burroughs discovered? How does it add to our knowledge of Liberian history? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Allen. And we're going to go to our last panelist, Mr. Weir. Aaron, have you been following? And you know you have a lot. Now you're the last but not the least. Can you hear us, Aaron? Can you unmute Aaron? Oh.
Thank you. Are you hearing me?
Yes, Aaron, we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Let me begin first by saying thanks to Dr. Burroughs. There has been much written about this historic find of the deed. And I want to join other speakers by saying that the discovery of this deed has come about when there has been multiple accounts around the history of Liberia, particularly around the Stockton account and the different versions of it. And here, this is testimonial to how our national attitude towards the past has been. how Liberians have leaned towards the past and have tried to oversimplify the past. On this point, I would like to premise my remark by making two broad observations. One, in the work on the National Symbols Project, Dr. Ewudon made the following observations. He said, in Dr. Don's execution of Liberian National Symbol Project, he observed that Liberians are more aware of the things that divide them than that which unite them. In Burroughs' study of citizenship and identity, he postulates that the notion of guilt by association is inherent in the Liberian psyche and a key function of how Liberians tend to interpret the past, especially pre-1980, especially post-1980, and especially during the period of the Civil War. If you put these two viewpoints together, there's been a historic discussion about, has Liberian existence been more about cooperation and conflict? If you put these two viewpoints together, I think Liberian existence has been more about conflict and less cooperation. So the question I ask here then is, does the bicentennial represent a point of departure and a deliberate move toward cooperation? I'm aware I'm asking a rhetorical question, but I'm also aware that this question captures my own aspiration of the new Liberia that we're all trying to envision. In response to this question here, I would like to say that event of this magnitude is normally preceded by a major work of commission investigation trying to address certain national question. By default, I think that the body of work produced at the Governance Commission come close to trying to shadow what the bicentenary is trying to grapple with, the key existential questions that are emerging. Also, it provides a baseline material to help you rethink or remodify this. The second point I want to make is that 1 year from today, in next year, we will be celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Accra Agreement. What this represents is that this is the first time after 2003, we'll be having a new generation that is new to violent conflict. What is the spirit of the bicentenary with such a young generation? In the 2008 Housing and Population Census, we were reminded that 65% of the Liberian population are those 65 and below, 35 years and below. It means a significant part of the Liberian population were those born during the war and during the Accra peace agreement. Why am I making this point? I'm making this point on the beginning statement I made that Liberians are more aware of what divides them than what unites them. And the whole guilt by association attitude that have come to define how we look back at the past. So my follow-up question here is, how is the bicentenary and making a deliberate move away from these things? I like to fall back on the historic discovery that Burroughs made, as a very important point of historical clarification. How is this adding up to the new direction that we are going? I know my remark is much about questioning, and then it's about making new comments. So I would like to stop there and on these questions that I've just raised. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. Your points are very instructive. It reminds me of in 2013, 2014, we celebrated as a country the 10-year of peace. And I see Senator Community Wisey in the audience. He was very involved in the celebration of the 10 years of peace. Now we're talking about celebrating 20 years of peace and political stability. So that's an achievement. Let me go down to Dr. Here. I understand he's live now. Dr. George Clee. Dr. Kier, you have been writing recently about contemporary issues in Liberian politics. Please bring to bear some of those contemporary issues and how do they juxtapose with what we are discussing right now. Is he on? Is Dr. Kier on? thought we thought you saw somebody. Okay, it looks like we do not have Dr. Kier on. We'll continue. If he joins us, certainly he will chime in. Now let's now open the discussion to members of the audience. You've heard the presentation, you've heard the responses from the panelists. It's your opportunity to pose a question or make a comment to either of the panelists here or the lead presenter. We have 2 microphones, 3 questions, and then we'll come back to the panelists to respond. Okay? So that is just tell us your name and which institution you're from, and then you ask your question. We recognize the gentleman right here. Please, hang on a little bit, get the mic so that our international audience can follow your question or your comment.
I'm from the diaspora. I was born in New Orleans, raised in South Central Los Angeles. And as I have been advocating for dual citizenship to Liberia, I came here in November, and we formed Youth Empowering Legislative Law to lift up Liberia's economy in various 12 sectors of economic development. And I see a need to rebrand Africa, and particularly Liberia, and rebrand Africa through Liberia. And I've always said that we need to rebrand Liberia to get our young people to buy into patriotism to Liberia, to own Liberia. And I see that directly in our history that has not been told, and debunking the myth, and I think we should do it through film because of the war and everything in the education system. A lot of our young people are visual. So I would like to enlist you guys to help us put together a documentary or film of this history that he just said, but keying in on our sea warfare, so to speak, of how we commanded the high seas right here from these shores with our repatriates that founded Liberia, with our African abolitionists that were here, and with those that were captured, that were freed by these very repatriates and abolitionists, so we can organize our young people and get them involved into owning Liberia to lift us up, lift Liberia.
Thank you very much. Very, very good point. The president, in his speech yesterday, advocated for the rewriting or the writing of our history. So that's a very good point. Dr. Allen, Dr. Dawn, have been involved with this historic project before, so they certainly will bring perspective on that. All right, question from, you tell us your name and where you're from.
Thank you, UL, for this very, very wonderful forum. Marjan Baker, we have an organization, it's called SOAR, Metz Africa 4D, and our key role is to promote the scientific discourse for a new generation of Liberians. We are unwrapping in June what we're calling the PASS, Pan-African STEAM Symposium. So the question I want to ask, and I think that one of the, must have been Mr. Allen, there's a comment that said, if you don't know where you're coming from, you don't know where you're going. And yes, unfortunately, many times what divides us is what we really, is a narrative that we really hear of most of the time. I want to know, in terms of inventors, for Liberia in the 1600s. Do you know of any, Dr. Burroughs or any one of the historians, any inventors in those years?
Good, definitely. This is a good point. You know, we're talking about all the knowledge. We have all this knowledge that you talk about. You know, we're looking at any inventor throughout this period that we need to write about. We're looking for the next question. Dr. Ali, you want to name one? Who's that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, I just want to take three and then we'll come back.
Hello?
Yes. We got one from this side. We got one from this one from this side. Okay, then we'll come back so that, you know, diversity and equilibrium. Lest we be a killing field, monopolizing the discussion on one side. Yes,
thank you, Honorable Tour. Dr. Burroughs, did we inherit, as young people of this country, did we inherit an education system that made us to just be submissive to people? You are a historian. Dr. Ewudon, I'm glad to see you today. My name is Dr. Benjamin Way, president of the La Costa State Training College. Did we inherit an education system that brought us down instead of elevating us? That's my question.
All right, you're profound and emotional. That's a profound question. All right, so we have three questions. You know, you can jump at it. The first one, certainly, is rebranding our history. Second one has a lot to do with whether we have an inventor. The last question is, what kind of educational system did we inherit? There seems to be too much susceptibility, you know, to others. Dr. Burroughs. Yes.
To your question about inventions, I will caution you against looking for individual inventors. Our society, our cultural context is collective. Once we shift, you know, our mindset, we can then see the many important inventions that took place here. Look at the suspension bridges, right, that were woven to cross over these chasms. We call them monkey bridge. That's engineering. Do I know the individual or one, if there was one individual who came up with that design? No. But it doesn't make it any less brilliant. When the Portuguese came along this Atlantic, they didn't know the Atlantic. They were learning. It was trial and error. But when they got here, they met our ancestors who knew the water like the back of their hands and could teach them. One of the problems the Portuguese had was there are two currents running in this Atlantic, two like rivers. One runs from west to east, it's close to the shore. And I'm giving you this knowledge from the Kru traditions. And the Portuguese will come in that river and it's carrying them towards the Gold Coast. Time to go back, they're trying to sail against that current. Many of the ships crashed along the coast. As they started interacting with our mariners, people said, no, there's another current over there, out in the ocean. If you get in that one, it will carry you the other way. Because our fishing folk would go out in the morning and they would travel, carry dry fish from Krukos to Kipmount, get in the other current and go back. They understood the tide, they understood the weather, they understood the breezes. All of that was required knowledge. Who made the canoes, the huge canoes that would go out in the Atlantic Ocean? So my charge to you is that the record is here of these spectacular inventions, but we won't be able to credit them to individuals because of our cultural context. And to the young man who asked a question about education, Generally, education tends to be discussed in two ways. One form is critical. People are taught critical thinking. And then there's another style of education that involves recitation of things that were memorized. And there has been an emphasis on memorization and regurgitation. And that's not very helpful. But you see, I think it's also important for students to recognize that you can't put all the weight on institutions. There are individuals in the midst of dysfunctional educational systems and schools who seize the mission of their own education, right? And they are determined to improve themselves, to improve their knowledge, and so forth. I met an individual when I first came back home at one of the events that I had, a book talk, and he was taking pictures. I didn't know him. At the end, he said, "Doc, I got some pictures of the event. You want to check them?" I looked at it. I was like, wow. So he came by the next day to share the pictures with me and to give him something. And I asked him, I said, "Where did you train?" He told me, "I watched photography videos on the internet. And I wish I could show you the work. The man is brilliant. But there are individuals who will, despite the odds, right, make sure that they improve their education." And I think I want to encourage students to make sure that they do that.
Good point. Dr. Allen, you wanted to come.
That it goes along with the communal invention that Dr. Burroughs mentioned. In 1886, there was a centennial fair in the United States. And Liberia was represented at that fair. What products did Liberia send to the fair, this international fair in Philadelphia? Liberia sent palm oil. Sent Liberia made sugar. The settlers along the Simpoa River were producing sugar from sugar cane, and they exported that sugar. Hardly any scholars knew about this production. When I was doing my dissertation research, I was able to find that information. So during the fair, sugar from Liberia and coffee from Liberia was displayed at that fair in Philadelphia. Guess what happened? Who won the award? The Liberian sugar, the Liberian coffee. The coffee won Best Coffee Award. It was competing with Brazilian coffee, competing with coffee from Cuba. Liberia won that certificate. I have the certificate in my dissertation. I haven't seen that information. What I'm saying, in connection to communal invention, we should also look at the individual. There were farmers along the Simpoa River who produced sugar and they exported sugar. The interesting thing about this information is that it came at a time when the notion was that Liberians were non-productive, but that Liberian sugar and Liberian coffee was being certificated in foreign parts.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A hand of applause for that. I want to bring Dr. Herbert Brewer in on this conversation relative to the last question about our educational system, that whether or not the educational system we inherited is submissive. You're writing the book, a new biography of former President Joseph Jenkins Roberts. He is credited in his will of leaving, all his lifetime inheritance to the education of Liberians. If Roberts was alive today, as we are, would you think he would be satisfied with the current state of affairs of our educational system, Professor Brewer?
I thank you, Mr. Toy. I smile at that question because I actually often think about it as well. What would he say? And as historians, we are trained actually not to think about that because we are very mindful, of change over time, and we are mindful of being ahistorical. We are mindful of anachronism. Roberts was a man of his time, and best that we leave him in his time. But I do think that he would probably like what he saw today. And people that might seem shocking. He might like some things that he sees about today. I'll put it that way. And other things he might be surprised at, or disappointed at. Like anybody else, if we ourselves thought about what we would see in 100 years from now, 200 years from now, we have no idea. But still, I like the spirit of the question. I think that oftentimes, as we grapple with these issues, as Roberts grappled with the issues of his day, it would benefit us if we started to think about Liberian history from a Liberian lens, use a Liberian gaze to look at Liberian history. And I think oftentimes we tend to the habit of looking at Liberian history through an American gaze. And that comes out of what I would call the ACS narrative. And I think that we should consider decentering that ACS narrative. So let me just propose this, a simple proposition. We start from the position that Liberia is the center of the world, and then we go from there. And that would help us, coming to terms with various issues as we confront them. And I think that Roberts himself might actually agree with that proposition. I'd like to think so.
Okay, very good, very good. Let's come back. The audience, is there some on the same point? We want to shift gear a little bit. See, yeah, and this is very important. So let's recognize the two distinguished ladies first. Former Foreign Minister King, and then followed by the Vice President of.
To Mr. Boros, I'm looking forward to seeing that original document deed. I want to. I'm Ulubanke King Akere, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Liberia. I want to pick up from your story about the coffee. My great-grandfather, CTO King I, who was one of the Sierra Leonean Yoruba immigrants to Liberia. He was Consul General for Brazil, okay? And he actually took Liberian coffee to Brazil. X number of years ago, as foreign minister, when I visited Brazil on a delegation with President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, it was mentioned by the Brazilians that their coffee came from Liberia. So I just want to commend what you just said about that. It was real. It was real. So I just wanted to add that I wasn't aware of the Philadelphia Fair, but once you spoke, I remembered this dimension. Thank you very much, and thank all of you for this extraordinary session. I want to commend the university also. I just wish there was some way that all these writings and all the excellent things that are coming out of Liberians could enter our school and educational system. It's not happening. It is not happening. It is so sad. I don't know how do we do this.
Yes.
We've got to do it, because clearly what we learned as children, right? As I think, Elwood, you said it, with more research, there's more information. So what we learned in history, I studied history at the University of Ibadan, okay, among some of the great West African names. But here in Liberia, I don't know where we are on this issue of history in our schools, of civics or whatnot. Look at all this beautiful, rich information.
Very
There's so
good.
many librarians. What do we do about it?
I can understand your frustration. I mean,
Can you hear me? Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roland Horton. I'm the president for Kajitan University. And I just want to piggyback on what Auntie Benke just said, because that was where I was going with this. We usually have these conferences, and we do not include the students who need to hear what we are saying. We have to shift the paradigm. Most of what's been said here, we in this room, we know. The students we need to be letting know what's happening are not here at this conference. And if we don't get our students involved in what is happening, we will not educate them for what we want them to do. So we need to involve the students that we are educating at these conferences so they hear the rich history of Liberia. Because if they don't know this, there is no way we will develop this country. You keep talking about rewriting our history. We're writing our history without their consent and without their knowledge. Uncle Ewu just said knowledge acquisition, it never ends. We have to include our students. They need to be of every conference that we have on Liberia and Liberia history. Thank you.
good point. Dr. Dawn, can you go up there, please, and respond? Because this question was directed to you.
Yes, I was thinking that we are really at a very critical moment. I'm not just talking about 2022, I'm talking about ending war and thinking about post-war Liberia. And then we are faced with what some call the education problematic. And what do we do? What have we done? It seems to me that we've divided this thing into two parts. We think about things tangible and we think about things intangible. So we came back here, or many people came back here after the war, and the school buildings are broken down, no benches are there. You have to get the kids back to school, get their uniforms together. You know, all of those things essential. But, you know, I get curious about what goes on in the classrooms. I just wonder what they teach. What sort of discussions take place in the classroom? What have we learned about pre-1980 Liberia in the classrooms, in first grade, second grade, fourth grade? What have we learned about the war? What have we done, for example, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report? How much have we drawn from that to make part of our curriculum? What do we do with some of these critical studies that are done by historians and other scholars? Do we make that part? I don't know. I'm raising questions so that the people who make decisions about curricular matter will be the ones that will have to respond to these things. So I think we have paid a lot more attention to the tangible things, and we have fallen short when it comes to these intangibles.
Thank you very much, Don. Okay, we're going to move on now. I mean, this first round of questions is very relevant to what we're discussing here. You want to stay on? We'll come and have you.
On my Facebook page, I always say my interest is Liberia. Everybody knows that. I live in New Jersey and I live in Liberia. I am the coordinator between the historic Providence Baptist Church and the historic Shiloh Baptist Church, which we have just celebrated the bicentennial of the church. And with Shiloh, we form a cooperation and collaboration, actually, and we bring folk back and forth. My pastor, the Reverend Dr. Dara LaRue Armstrong, who sits on the board of Princeton University, during the bicentennial brought a message to the Republic of Liberia from Princeton University. They discovered in their research, and now they have made it college-wide, that the Colonization Society actually started in New Jersey and at the Princeton Theological Seminary. So they came with a proposal of a restitution to the Republic. At the closing service for the country, the people who should have been there to listen to this message that was brought to the Republic were not there, which were our leaders and our children. And as my two colleagues have just said, it is so vital here as we sit. Do we know the students in this audience? Are they University of Liberia or history students? Because if we're talking about the University of Liberia, who else should be here listening, and who would be the future messengers for the history that we're talking about? Dr. Patrick Burroughs, I must commend. He's my partner. We do a lot of work together. He has inspired me. And Dr. Burroughs, this question is going to go to you. Again, I am from the Dane tribe, my maternal side. And I didn't know the history as much. I listened to the oral when I was growing up. I listened to the oral when I was growing up. And you hear a little bit of here and there.
Then can you speed up, please?
And then you hear a lot of myths, which Dr. Burroughs alluded to. Our country is full of myth. So a lot of the things that we do is based upon hearsay, they say, and so we don't have it right. And when I met Dr. Burroughs and we begin to talk, and he began to talk about the Dane people and the history of the Dane people, I took it upon myself to put forth. So I don't know if anyone have seen my presentation with Providence. I always start off by saying, I'm a neo, I'm a wet. I'm a neo, meaning that we the ancestors who were, and the response is, I'm aware, here we are, or we live again. And at the Providence Island, I talk about Zulu Duma. The New Johnson Street Bridge is named for Zulu Duma. There's a flag that's on that bridge, but we don't know about it. We don't know about it.
Right.
So Dr. Burroughs,
yes, please,
in terms of the myth of the Dane people, and not just only the Dane people, let's say the Bassa people, which my father is from, we don't swim because we're afraid of water. Why? It's because we believe in something called Niji. And because of that Niji, no one wants to go near water, even up to today. So, Professor, I forgot your name, who talked about the
Dr. Ali.
About the things. Let's look at recent Liberia. Liberia was, by AGOA was selected, 17 products of Liberia were selected to be represented in the United States in 2019, I believe. The rice, red rice, ruby red rice, and the pearly white rice, best rice, come from our country. The Simpor rum.
Ma'am, just wrap up now. We have to move on, please.
Another thing
we have to have
that you
people
brought
got to
up.
go to someone else. So please ask your question, and then we'll
so
just
Dr.
go quick.
Burroughs, if you will elaborate a little bit
Yes.
more on the myth and to the University of Liberia issue as far as our students are concerned.
Very good. We're going to take, let's take Councilor, former president of the Liberian National Bar Association. There's a microphone right behind you, sir. No, we let's take
Let me stand here because My dean should have been here.
Yes.
You're talking about deed.
Yes. So
That's legal issue. Now,
and the T is the best evidence.
so that's the problem. And I want the historians to look at how the issue of deed even divided us. How did they contribute to the conflict that goes on today? Because the returnees came, and they were not the one talking about deeds. Those who brought them decided to purchase land from people who had no knowledge of purchase of land. They just resided on the land. The Portuguese came here. Other people came here. They did their trade and they left. And they brought not money, but they brought goods. And the people were told later on, they didn't even know that they had sold their land. And that the land they sold was the exclusive preserve of those who purchased it. And that the owners of the land, whom the Declaration of Independence called the lords of the land, could not step on the land purchased anymore without the permission of those who purchased the land. I'm thinking, maybe on hindsight, listening to Professor Asante this morning, that perhaps if the returnees had just assimilated among the people, take Gola names, take Bassa names, take the crew names and all of that, the Gribble names, settle among them, live in their houses, build their own later on, don't think about purchasing land, perhaps they will have easily assimilated, integrated, and some of the divisions that still affect us today would not have happened. So that's something to think about, that this deeding of land, 1,000 acres, 2,000 acres to deal. Today, people still defy the deed because there are people in this country who have 5,000 acres of land, and there are 3 or 4 towns in those land areas, and then they come and they say, "This is my land." The people say, "For our people know that for generations that's where they live. So where do you want us to go?" And that's the next thing that we really have to deal with. Because those who purchased the land were in authority. They purchased 10,000 acres of land. Nobody knows what the purchases were. And the owners, those who resided on the land, did not have any say in it. Because according to our law, once the chief gave permission, and nobody knows whether the chief consulted with those who actually lived on the land, and the district commissioner and the superintendent approved, they took the deed to the president and the president signed. And some people have been living there up to now, and somebody comes today and say, "I want to plant rubber on this land and I have to remove you." It's a major source of conflict. So I think the whole idea of deed just from the beginning was the beginning of our conflict and a failure to assimilate and learn the languages. The failure to assimilate, take the local names like Asante has done, and no one will have known the differences. That would have been a real return. These are the comments.
Very, very interesting point, but Councillor Dr. Ali has an article in which he described indigenous and American Liberian Union. I mean, I think there was some things were done to that effect, but Dr. C. Patrick Boros, yes, please. It's important because, you know, the purchase as you described seem to be calling into question the discrepancy in terms of the understanding. You know, people were here, residing on the you know, and you come, 2 white men came, and one of them brandished a pistol and said, the land, you know, all of that stuff. That was not the understanding of our people at the time, according to the councillor. How does that change the perspective in terms of the deed, which, you know, It's the best evidence, It's there.
So, in response to your comment, Councillor, I will point out first of all that in all of what I've written so far, or has been published about what I have done, the word deed does not appear. But people use the word in a common sense approach. Not legally, but in a common sense approach, because words have more than one meaning. Now, I don't know if you were here for the earlier presentation, as I was speaking about some of the issues that you broached. But I would never walk into the courtroom and presume to represent someone on a legal matter. So I would just ask that when it comes to matters of history, consult with us because of our area. We spend the time preparing ourselves in order to share this knowledge with our society. Just give us the credit. It's not for nothing that we do this work. The second thing I would like to say is that with historians, we recognize the need to periodize. You say, this thing happened at this time. Then sometime later, something else happened. It was different. The Liberia that we know today did not exist then. You were talking about presidents and district commissioners in 1821, 1822, 1848. None of the district commissioners did not exist. The Berlin Conference transformed Liberia internally as well as externally. Now, we need to recognize these things because otherwise we are promoting a sense of the history that is really just not supported by the evidence. How did Liberia change because of the Berlin Conference? According to the Loma oral tradition, a conference was called at the border. The French, the Liberian government were present. And the rulers of the Loma people were asked, do you want to go with the French or you want to go with the Liberians? And the border was drawn on the basis of the choices made by our ancestors. Then afterwards, now, we living many generations later, we want to kick them to the side and say, they didn't know. We know better. And I'm urging that we are careful. Here's one thing I would like to leave with you. Relationships change. I have a friend who was bearing his soul to me about his marital problems. And he's telling me about his wife and the fact that, she was never in love with him, and she was always behaving in ways that were unacceptable. And I had to sit here and say, my man, you know I was around when you were courting that woman? You know I was at your wedding? You are not singing this song what you're singing now. And he said, oh man, look, man, move right here. You'd like to, bring up those kinds of things. We have a choice, whether as intellectual leaders or leaders in other capacities, to be able to say that when relationships turn rocky, we must not take that and project it backwards, if it was not so. And I would say to you that the conditions that obtained at Cape Mesurado at the time that I've studied it was not the condition that you just described. I think it's a projecting backwards of certain things that you know from more recently. Now, as far as the deed is concerned, Dr. Allen had asked me about this, so the deed, quote-unquote, or purchase agreement. What I'd like to say is that in the 1830s, the American Colonization Society put a committee together and asked that they compile any purchase agreement for different tracts of land, pieces of land. So the committee put together the agreements for Caldwell, what became Caldwell, part of Busho Island, etc. They couldn't find Cape Mesurado. But by that time, newspapers had published the text. And so historians started citing the published text from newspapers. But most of the authorities on Liberia would acknowledge that we haven't seen the actual document. We are quoting the newspaper accounts. So I was writing about this negotiation, and I wanted to find the original if I could. Historians prefer to look at the primary rather than secondary source. I knew there were three lawyers the ACS usually relied on for these business, these committee assignments, legal assignments. I went looking for their papers. The first person had dropped off the map. He's not famous. People don't know about him. The second was Francis Scott Key, the lawyer and the person who wrote the American National Anthem. His papers were right near where I was living. I went there. I went through them, legal papers, etc. Nothing was there. I'm getting discouraged, but I'm looking. And the third person was Elias Caldwell. And when I searched for his papers, I found some of them were among the papers of Justice Bushrod Washington. And those are in a museum. And what happened apparently, now I know, Caldwell was serving as the secretary on a voluntary basis. It was not a permanent job for the ACS. But his full-time job was with the Supreme Court. He was clerk. He died with papers of the ACS in his possession. And those papers ended up being packed up with the papers of Justice Bushrod Washington, and that contract was in it. So I just wanted to say in closing, I brought copies of the purchase agreement that I wanted to leave with Dr. Allen. And you can see how I know that it seems to me to be authentic is the handwriting is Dr. Eli Ayers. The document itself, Dr. Eli Ayers. And his name is signed at the bottom, the same handwriting, and then you see the other names that are there. As I said before you came, Counselor, the rulers of Cape Mesurado had at their disposal a scribe and an interpreter who was educated in Liverpool while they were negotiating this agreement, among other things that we can't go into right now. But thank you.
Okay, so we're going to be presenting, Dr. Ali is going to receive on behalf of all of us in the university, the copy of, you mean the copy that we just recently discovered. And then so we can make some comparison to see whether is the same, that has been around or different, because it's very, very important, Counselor, in law, the evidence law of our country says that the evidence that the case must admit must always be the best. There is no existence of a better evidence. However, if the original best evidence is not available, the court will allow a duplicate version. Now that we have found the original version, we will compare the original with the duplicate. It might be the same, or it might be, different. Right, folks? All right. Let's move on now to the last round. The last round. Our panelists are still with us via online, right? Good. We're going behind now because we yes. Don't worry. I will recognize. So we'll go way over there. There's a lady way in the back there. Please tell us him, and then we'll come in the middle. And is there education here? Okay, Minister will come in. Don't worry, Benjamin. All right. Come on.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone.
I'll get you, and then we'll get Sister Lang.
Honorable panelists, one thing that has really, really disturbed me this evening.
You come from. What am I to?
Is on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was completely disturbed when I heard Dr. Boros.
Project your voice a little bit, man.
Yeah, I was completely disturbed.
Okay.
First, Robert Stone waved his gun only to be given a chance to speak. But the waving of signals intimidation. It signals inciting of fear. Just imagine you going up pictures. To me, it was a form of manipulation for them to do whatever they needed for them to do with the document. So they are really, really disturbing. We need to look at it in the history book. It's not a decent thing to do then, and it's not a decent thing to do now.
Very good. Talking about buying land, somebody's brandishing a weapon, is intimidating, she's profaning the step of that. Okay, we're not going to make assumptions here. We want to demystify it, and then we'll come back to the panelists. Sister Mary Laurie, please, you have the mic.
Yeah, I'm Sister Mary Lorraine from Vice Chair for Board of Trustees. Firstly, let me commend the panelists up there, and in particular Dr. Burrows, for what he has shared with us. I think I'm simply making a comment rather than asking a question. I think one of our major problems when it comes to our history of who we are is the lack of continuity. I think of President Charles Taylor. He initiated Vision 2020, and we're in 2022. And then President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf started Vision 2030. And there were a lot of resources that were put into that. Young people went to every part of Liberia to come back with relevant reports. And as we sit here today, that whole thing is dormant. Everything that was spent is practically lost. And I think had it been continued, perhaps our discussion wouldn't have reached this far. In other countries, whatever was done, the whole vision process was taken to the legislature and then passed into law. I was given the responsibility to engage some of the legislators. When we did that officially, but privately, one of our very senior members said to me, "Sister, you think, so when we all do this thing together, then Ellen Johnson will take this credit." And I think that is the mentality that is keeping us back. Thank you.
Okay, good. You're right. We have, bundle of knowledge upon knowledge, exists. We have to apply the knowledge. We have to, take advantage of the knowledge. I want to thank the Minister of Education right now. We're not putting you on the spot, Mr. Minister, but before you came, there was a question asked, and I see why Benjamin Way wants you to chime in on this as to whether our educational system that we inherited is relatively, substandard.
It depends.
Does our education system make us submissive? I think that was the question. It depends.
Okay, thank you. There's something about family reunions. It reminds those current that there is something from the past that we need to reflect. And I'm very happy with this 200th anniversary celebration. This is a family reunion. And matters that we had placed into archives of our minds are waking up. And I believe going forward, many of those things which we thought were not relevant anymore is staring us in the faces. And so something will change going on. I want to thank Dr. Burrows and and all of Dr. Dunn and Dr. Allen and all the other colleagues that we listen to, those scholars, those historical scholars. There are a couple of things that we've done being in the education space. I just want to bring you up. In the past 6 years or so, before we even became minister, cumulatively, there has been a team working on restoring civics. If any of you remember, the active teaching of physics, of civics, went down in the 80s. We try to bring that back up. Dr. Sawyer and team that have been working assiduously, I'm sorry he's not too well now, but the books for civics have been researched and redone and divided into grades so that it is easier for the reading public to be able to catch up. So we now have first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, each of them with their little books going back to things that we have forgotten. I'm hoping civics, as much as it relates us to our own society, it does not teach the detail of the history that we seem to have forgotten. Even I, forgotten a lot more. But when I was in grade school in the early 60s, that's ever since, the history that we learned were a lot more comprehensive than now. But the danger we have now is, you go to the various universities, very few students want to think of majoring in history. They either doing accounting, economics, and all that stuff. I think it is a suggestion that is not too important. Very few, in fact, insignificant number does geography. And geography are being taught in school. For God's sake, what is being taught? Even if the curriculum was rich and properly written, if the person who is teaching it does not have the content capacity to present it from knowledge and experience, they're talking spider story. And this is a challenge we have. And I'm going to throw that back to the universities and colleges so that we begin to find a way where these can be done. I just wanted to ask beyond this, Norris, if it's possible, we need to get these brains that still live to extract those information that they have. Because if not, they will go with them. We need to get those information out of them and recompile the history in more detail than we have now. And from here, I'm convinced that we can get it right from this book. Thank you very much for this program.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. We're going to go back to the panelists. We're going to take Dr. Allen, and then we'll go to Dr. Burrell, and then we'll go back to the audience. We will now move very fast. Each speaker will speak for less than 2 minutes, so that we can run through this process. Dr. Allen, you wanted to come in on the question of or you want us to go to Burrell? Yes.
One of the
you got to do something.
brandishing guns.
Yes, brandishing guns.
Yes, she says that in the history books that we've read, it says that Robert Stockton brandished a gun, or he held a gun to one of the indigenous chiefs' head, and that's why he signed the deed. So this is what Dr. Burroughs calls a myth. He said it didn't happen. It didn't happen that way. So it is important that we provide that evidence so that we know that when we remove it from the table that it's a myth, then we say, here is the evidence that supports that myth. So we'll wait for the evidence. Dr. Burroughs has the deed. I don't know whether that information is in the deed that he can share so that what we taught the students in class, they will know that it was based on evidence, that she will not be disturbed.
But Dr. Allen, I mean, what would the D show? Would the D show that he didn't brandish a gun? I mean, the fact that there is evidence that he brandished a gun. She's saying it's intimidating, whether directly or indirectly. Is the new find deed, will that demystify the myth, or are there any other documentary evidence that can contradict that myth? Yes, Professor Doctor. I mean, that's what Dr. Ali talked about, new knowledge. If there is no new knowledge, that one will persist.
I hope those of you who heard my presentation recall some of what I said. Because what I said was, in fact, that Captain Stockton pulled the pistols from his pants. And he gave one to Ayers and said, hold it directed at this guy. And he took the other pistol and pointed it at Tower Peter. The brandishing of the weapon took place. What I did say also, which seems like maybe people are not paying attention, is that weapons were common in this area. There were about 60 to 80 muskets in the crowd of people who surrounded the Palaver Hut where the negotiations were going on at one point. People were not living in a pristine environment without access to the most sophisticated items available on the market, including guns. So the issue, and I want to speak to Dr. Allen's point, finding the document, that's what the media played up. That's what is important to them. But my research is about the negotiations that went on at the time. And in the beginning of my presentation, I referred to two important sources of information. One is the diary or journal that Dr. Ayers kept. And upon the conclusion of negotiation, it was mailed to the U.S. So there was no time to for him to revise the story and try to make it juicy or look favorable to him. He recorded it the way it was. And the second set of sources that I used were oral histories, particularly of the day. And the day said the matron of the Standing Society was facilitating the negotiations behind the scenes. That there was a degree and order in the society established in her name because of her role, and that order was related to hospitality. When the strangers came, she provided kinu, she provided thatch for the original housing where they slept. That's the day people saying it. So those are the sources I'm talking about, and you won't look at it, the agreement and find references or discussions of the reference.
Let's bring in Dr. Brewer back into the discussion, because you're writing a book about Joseph Jenkins Roberts again. This man owned a lot of property that he bequeathed to educate Liberian children. And we're having a conversation about this purchase of the land. One person in the audience asked a question about the gun. Brandishing the gun was a sign of intimidation, that eventually. What did you find in your research, in your evidence about this acquisition and then subsequently the land that, President Roberts inherited, which he bequeathed subsequently? What are you finding in this in terms of the narrative?
Yeah, thank you. So part of the history, and this is complex history, part of the history of Liberia is a history of land, obviously, and land tenureship. And again, we would caution people to not simply read the present into the past. Mm-hmm. The transfer of land took place in stages. the transfer of land took place in a variety of ways. Once the evolving or the developing or the emerging state called Liberia established laws, a set of laws, one of the key parts of the establishment of this state is this principle of private property and the whole legal framework that comes with private property, right? And that basis itself has that history. Once that is established, and we can discuss how that is established, that is one part of the story. The other part of the story is that once it is established, grants of land are assigned to immigrants, the people who come under the auspices of the ACS. And so Roberts himself is one of those beneficiaries. Right? So the land that Roberts would convey in the future into the trust for education, that is how he comes by that land. So yes, he does convey that, and I guess it reflects Roberts' own idea of a legacy and a Liberian state to grow and the foundation of education. But the larger question beyond Roberts is just this idea of private property itself, which actually would warrant a nice long discussion. This idea of private property. Now, but since we're leaving, I just would like to again restate this challenge, I think, to Liberian intellectuals, that the need for epistemological sovereignty, in other words, the sovereignty of the imagination. And to do that does really require Liberians to decenter the ACS narrative and to center the Liberian experience in the questions they ask and the approaches they take going forward as a way to, I guess in a way, find solutions, find a way forward in understanding our history, understanding our past.
Well, thank you. Let me come back to you, Cassandra. During your presentation, you seem to choke up a little bit. When you were making the point about history, the knowledge. Did it have to do with something about the land acquisition or the misinterpretation of our history? What was it about? Yes, please.
I think maybe to echo some of the points that Dr. Brewer was making, it's really about this epistemological quest and the resistance against that kind of activity. And related to that, I think just the language that we use, we need to be careful about sometimes, right? So I think what I wanted to say is the question was about villagers on the coast, and I think this was already mentioned earlier, but I think we need to remind ourselves that the coast of West Africa was a global dealing with people who had no idea about the outside world. We're dealing with people who knew to negotiate for what they needed and what they wanted, and so that's an important part of this puzzle as well. So thinking of language, thinking of context, and not diminishing this rich history that we're dealing with.
Very good. In an attempt to demystify the, assumptions, precisely the point all of the speakers have been making. All right, we're going to take two more. We're going to right here in the middle, Dane from St. J, and then we'll go back, and then we'll go here. And then I think after that, we'll come back to the panelists and Dr. Brewer and Dr. Boros for closing, and then we'll move on. We got a big dinner coming up tonight, so don't worry. Yes, madam.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kula Fofana. I am the assistant dean at the David Estras University of Liberia. In support to what Sister Lauren said, I also worked during the post-2015 agenda, specifically the Vision 2030 as co-chairperson, and I think there was a lot of work done. It will also be my hope that after this conference, that the University of Liberia hosts similar activities in relation to discussing historical narrative about where we are. So my question is in twofold. One, there is currently a debate within the student community about what we're celebrating, especially on the margins of the bicentennial, whether it is the 1822 to 2002, or should it be 1847 to 2047? So that question, I'm hoping that any of the historians on the panel can, throw, some light on it. And the second part has to do with, in light of celebrating our history, especially this earlier conversation with Dr. Asante and the rest of the panelists and Dr. Boer's research in looking at our history before 1822. If we're celebrating 200 years from 1822, what happens to the activities, what this part of the word was? Are we, again, permeating or continuing celebrating Liberia from 1822 upward? What then happens to the successes, the research, the activities, and this whole conversation around who we were before the settlers came? If you see how extravagant, the activities of this bicentennial celebration, the mimicking of the ship Elizabeth at the stadium, you see that at the Providence Island, you see the Mayflower. If we continue to celebrate that portion of our history, what happens to the ones before? Even though, yes, at the time it was in Liberia, but there, it didn't, history is not just happening during the occurrence, our own history is not authored when it is occurring, but it's authored when it is telling. So where are we? What would be the recommendation from the panel so that we too appreciate the work that was done or that have been done by the ancestry in celebrating and appreciating our history, our culture, from whence we come, where we are, and where we intend to go? Thank you very much.
Very good point. We need to go before and then now and then. That's the whole idea about the UL Renaissance, right? Let's not just look at the history from a period of time, but we have to go beyond, make every effort. And I think precisely Dr. Boer's delivery tried to do that when he talked about, the 1400s, the 1500s. Let's take the gentleman in the suit over there. Please tell us your name and where you're from, and then we'll go to the gentleman over there, and then we'll come back to the panelists, and then we'll wrap this up, right?
Thank you.
Right. Yes, okay, good. We'll take if we have time. All right, please. Good. Can we get the mic to him while he's, I know he's loud enough, but for the audience via online, we're not hearing you. Thank you.
Probably because I'm not wearing a coat. Again, my name is Jerry Tupoboe. I'm from Scotland. I'm a Liberian. I've been in Scotland for over 25 years, and I've been a researcher on Africa, and Liberia has been my model of research. And I came to this 26 team in Glasgow, and I have been in some Scottish people, African languages, which is Bassa and Crew, where what I want to say is that our position as Liberia goes beyond what we are talking about today. Because when we look at slavery, it was stolen. If you throw somebody in the water, you don't expect him to come out dry. And so, as the result, our history was taken to dimension and cultural dynamics, and identity is one of those. The Socrates, the Pythagoras, they who studied in Egypt, and there was nowhere called Greece, it was Perth. There was nowhere called Rome, it was Scotia. They came and studied in Egypt and took all the knowledge from the African scholar. And as this morning speaker was saying, and when they went and they came and invade Africa, they damaged all our books and history and the rest of it, and established institution. And so our own color, we are afraid of it. This melanin color you have is what sustains life. It's what makes you to have more music. It's what makes your immune system to be more active. It's why your sound system is important. Now, what I want to ask is that if we are talking about Liberia, what's about our culture? When I mean culture, the ethnicity that make us unique. What are we doing about it? Because what we're talking about is about the history. But can we talk about the culture? Because right now we don't have a culture center anymore. And of course, those cultures are unique to Liberia. How do we fit that in within the bicentenary and this discussion? Thank you.
Very good. We're going to go right. Please. Mike. Yeah, right here. Yeah, right up there. Please be brave and let's move on.
Thank you. May I thank the erudite panelists and speakers. My name is Rupel E. Marshall Sr. I'm part of a group of elders that are trying to re-establish the Africana room at the University of Liberia.
Give me a big hand of applause, please. I heard about that project.
And we'd like to recommend that it become a tangible part of trying to get our history together. We hope a lot of money can be found to make that room a true depository of all the writings that relate to our country. Lastly, political correctness. True for any nation, and certainly for Liberia, is devastating to the history of any people. It affects what Sister Brown was saying about continuity. If I come to power, regardless, I would assume in Caucasian countries, as in African country, political correctness may say, let's leave that alone. I want to suggest to historians to be the front generals against political correctness that ends up not getting the true picture of Liberia or of any country. Thank you.
Very good. Something is being done to encourage these materials. So we're going to take the last comment from our sister all the way behind there. And then we'll come back to the panelists and Dr.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the panelists. It's been an honor to be here and learn from your wealth of knowledge and your work. I would like to make a comment.
What's your name, ma'am, please, and which institution you're from?
My name is Yafala Pawon. I'm the director for Medical Liberia, a women's rights organization. So I want to say thanks to the panelists, thanks to Dr. Cassandra Mark Thiessen, the only female on the panel. We hope that the next time UL does a conference, we have a very good representation of women. Thank you for your work. So the contributions, the role and collective efforts of women have not always been properly documented in history. Liberian history is no exception. And like the speakers have all stated, we cannot move forward and chart a new course if we rely on distorted accounts of history. Dr. Boris indicated in his presentation that as part of the myths he's discovered about our history, Liberian women, or the role of Liberian women, has not always been highlighted. We hear more about the role men played in the history. So how can historians, researchers, civil society be more deliberate about including the stories of women, about mainstreaming gender in their research work, as Dr. Boris has done? I'd like to hear the speakers' comment and thoughts on that. Thank you.
Very good. we will have time for one more comment. I don't see the individual in the audience. That will be Senator Kamine B. Wise. He's been here all through. Perhaps, let's go back to panelists, and then we'll move. Let's start from Dr. Don. Yes, final comments, and then if there's anything that you wanted to respond to, yeah, please go up there.
Just a quick one on what I have written here called History and Historians at one level versus the social media, and at another level versus political authorities. And what do I mean by this? I'm sure all of you know what I mean when I say history and historian and the social media. In other words, we are living at a time when anybody can do anything and publish anything anywhere. What is the impact of that on the serious study of history? How many Liberian historians do we have? I've been counting. I mean, I'm talking about those who go to school and major in history. I'm not one of them. I'm more like a history buff, a history enthusiast. I found my way into the archives of the Episcopal Church in Austin, Texas, and says I was doing research on writing the history of the Episcopal Church of Liberia. I found my way at the archives in Washington, D.C., and I just plunged into it. So I'm not in that category, but we need to begin to address that issue, and I thought the Minister of Education alluded to a little bit of that as well. How do we get our historians together in the midst of this social media craze, if you want to call it that? Second thing, I imagine these things. I sat somewhere, I heard the government of Liberia had set up a national steering committee to plan this thing. And I said to myself, wouldn't it be a nice thing if there were a round table and the real Liberian historians, I mean those who major in history, you invite them around that table. You say, we're coming to talk history, so come tell us history. And guide us in terms of what we will do with this commemoration so that we come out of it with some clear forward movement plans, ideas, projects. That's where my mind is at this point in time. History, historians, the media, the social media, history, historians, and all political authorities. And that ties in with what Sister Mary Lauren Brown was saying earlier on, Vision 2020, Vision 2030, and what we do with all that material. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. On closing remarks now, I'd like to now call on Senator Wise. Even though he's not a panelist or presenter, however, he's very close to the University of Liberia, and I'd like him to make some few closing remarks, especially the fact that he's been with us all throughout this conference. Is the most senior government official also.
Well, thank you. I hope that senior government official business has been used in order to find more money for the university. I was here this morning when Dr. Asante spoke, and the other speakers, and there was a huge reference to Dr. Mary Anthony Brown Sherman. So I wanted to start with these remarks by talking about this morning's session, and to say that when Dr. Mary Anthony Brown Sherman became president, it coincided with the time that I became president of the University of Liberia Students' Union. We had then created what is called the University of Liberia Students' Union. Also, before that time, it was Student Council. Now, as students, we convened a meeting at the Centennial Pavilion, the executive pavilion, that is. And we invited Dr. Sherman and presented to her a sword as the instrument she needed to use to fight corruption at the university, to show the way to academic freedom, and dig up the truth about Liberia. And she lived up to it for the year that I worked with her. She left a special legacy that we always pray that the university would revert to. First African, yes, 5 African women to become president, and all the others who followed. Judge Shanna, Emma Walter Shanna, first woman judge. I guess that was the first also senior judge in Africa, and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Now, there's something to be said about that part of our history. Sometimes we forget. But let me go on to the thing that got me interested in history. I entered the university not as a history student, but we had worked with Jane Martin, and we created the Historical Society at the university. And most of us were not students of history. So I have to say the scholars and the presenters are people that I respect very, very immensely. And they are extraordinary people, each of them in their own right. But when I heard Dr. Patrick Borrow say that Councillor did not have, more or less, should not be making comment on history because he didn't study history, if it sounded like that, it just reminded me of talking about our country. I think we must encourage everyone to show interest in our history. My boss, Banky, I think she's in the audience, is not a history student, but she has been doing wonderful work on Liberian history. I don't think that the one that I know about Dr. Dunn, I don't think that Dr. Dunn studied history but political science. Over the weekend, I went to see Dr. Guanu. He did not study history, but he's been doing wonderful work at history. Those who study are the professionals to guide us in showing our interest in history. I know that something is wrong with history because just in my lifetime, I listened to students and telling how LINSU, the Liberian National Students Union, was founded. No one refers to me. I'm the founding president. They're telling stories. I go to they tell us about 1979. I was one of the 5 named as the ringleaders who caused the trouble in 1979. I listened to stories, fairy tales. But then I say that I am to be blamed because I did not write, and I ought to write. And I must sit with Dr. Burroughs, my very good friend and comrade, to teach me how to do it better. I think we talk, that interest from the university, I ran into exile, running from the military regime, and I worked with I became director of the William E.B. Du Bois Memorial Center for Pan-African Culture in Ghana. I was not a history student. They saw the interest that I had shown in Pan-Africanism, and being there, I met with some of the most outstanding, including Julius Nambreri, telling us about history. Yet, in the Ghanaian storytelling about Pan-Africanism, they were saying everything began with Ghana. I had to correct that the progenitor of Pan-Africanism is Liberia and Ethiopia. I had to. I am only saying that, we have to do something about this history business. Because, I took my son to school in North Carolina, at the University of North Carolina, and up to that point, I had not made up my mind what to advise this young man to do. Then we met a teacher, a history teacher. They sent us there, a Dutchman. And he began to explain what history does to someone. Dr. Burroughs, I think, was joking when he said, people who go to history become the stupid ones. That's not true. The most intelligent in society, the one that we follow, people we follow, in our traditional setting, the person who is the speaker, the batipo, is the historian, the most intelligent. Is this word that is the final word. Amen?
Amen. Thank you.
So you historians, we will follow you. And the fact that there are differences in how you interpret doesn't make it wrong. We must continue to look for the truth. And I want to tell you that as a senator in the legislature, I stand up all the time when I'm talking. They tell me, my man, that old story. But the new story, when they are telling it, it doesn't do good for our country. You have to know the old story so that you don't repeat the wrong in society, so that we can keep doing the right thing. And that's what they are here to do for us. And this is what we must learn to do. 20 years, next year, will be the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement.
Correct.
I'm probably the only person in this room who was a signatory to that peace agreement. Today, the young people, when they're telling what happened, oh man, that old story, man, they don't even believe that war took place in Liberia. So they are doing exactly the same things that led to the war. I want to thank all of you who came to listen to them. And we ask you to continue doing the great work for our country. God bless you all.
Thank you very much. Very humbling, Senator. Your wisdom is very humbling. Thank you very much. Okay, we're taking final comments now. Before I will come to you, Cassandra, you can take your, and then from there we'll go to Dr. Brewer, and then Aaron, and then we'll come to Dr. Burroughs, and then Dr. Ali.
Okay, thank you very much. To end, I just wanted to say that, as a woman in particular, I think it's very dangerous when men talk about definitive histories. I don't know if that really exists. I think maybe sometimes the truth lies in between different narratives. So we need to think about different narratives and think about debate and think about leaving room for different, not just the trained historians, but different voices to enter the discussion. So there's no definitive ending of the story. We need to open room for more discussion. I think one of the shortcomings of Liberian history is this focus, and we're talking about mostly men writing this history, but is this focus on the nation state? So whether the nation state at the official level or at the more ethnic level, it's always that kind of focus. And so to respond to the young woman who commented earlier, there are so many interesting, creative, unorthodox archives out there that are not about government papers, that are not about presidents, that are not about, the village professor and all these things. There is room for creativity, for other people to gain visibility in Liberian history. So we shouldn't forget that either as we end this day. So it's not just about politics, I think, is my message. Yeah. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, please do.
Thank you, Cassandra. Very, very, again, powerful. Aaron, we'd like to take your final comments. I know you have taken in all the various comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Norris. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Let me begin by saying thank you. Thank you to the university. Thank you to the government for organizing this. Liberia has been in the news. A lot of interest has been aroused. People are eager to see what next, how is the bicentenary celebration going to shape Liberia development for the next couple of years. Drawing on some of the remarks from plenary and going back on my own earlier remarks, I see that there's a growing consensus that some foundational work has been done in the first administration after the Accra Agreement. Work around Liberia, the rewriting of Liberia comprehensive history. There are some blueprints there that the need for continuity with this government is something that should be considered. The issue of the National Symbols Project, the issue of the national vision, as Sister Lauren rightly said, drew on some of the best mind that Liberia have and some of the best expertise in the sub-region. So there have been considerable work done, work that essentially try to grapple with existential questions that the bicentennial celebration is also trying to grapple with. So we do not need to look too far. I think part of the question here is how do we reconcile politics, with key issues of nation building? What new consensus do we want to forge around Liberian identity? How do we want to forge this new consensus by trying to reconcile politics of today with politics of yesterday to come up with some of the best answers. So let me say thank you for inviting me on this panel, and thanks to you, Norris, for managing the exchanges, both home and away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. I hope to see you very soon in person. Dr. Howard Brewer, please give us your parting comments.
Yes, again, thank you for the invitation again. And I want to basically echo, for the most part, both Aaron's and Cassandra's remarks concerning history. For me, a couple of quick reflections. Historians, of course, can bring a perspective to bear on these big, important, and national issues, as always. But history, I want to remind people as well, history is several perspectives. And although people can agree on specific facts, it's always subject to interpretation. And so part of history, the process of history, is not just what happened in the past, but it's also arguments that people have about what happened in the past. I've mentioned this before, I'll mention it another way. I think the challenge to Liberian historians and then intellectuals beyond that is the whole process of, or the requirement really, to decolonize the archives. And that phrase might sound new to some people, and people in their various comments reflect that difficulty and that problem. Both the people who are arguing for and against, for example, the perspective or the interpretation that Dr. Boris has proposed, rely, for the most part, on the very same archives. And so I'm asking, if folks could actually broaden their, their perspective, their understanding, to understand indeed, how you get the truth and where do you build that knowledge from. So decolonizing the archives, starting to question indeed where we get knowledge from, where we get truth from. Those are like fundamental building blocks towards attempting to reconstruct a history that is inclusive, that includes the various peoples that make up Liberia, the national history of Liberia, indeed the pre-national history of Liberia as well. So once again, thank you very much. And it's been a pleasure being here and sharing this with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We now ask that Dr. Patrick Burrows to make his parting comments, and then Dr. Allen will close as chair of the History Subcommittee of the National Bicentennial Commemoration, and then Dr. Julius Zauda Nelson will come to thank our esteemed panelists, and we'll close this section right away.
I want to reiterate what I said at the very beginning, to thank Dr. Nelson and the University of Liberia family for the opportunity to be here. It has been profoundly moving in ways that you cannot imagine. Given my relationship with the university, long term and its importance to my own personal development. And I appreciated the interchange with colleagues regarding this particular moment in our history, right, the work that has been done. I am optimistic about our movement forward in regards to our relationship with history. Yes, Senator, I was joking when I was talking about the parents who order the children in that way. There are some who think that way, and they say, well, you going to college, you better study finance, accounting, or so forth. But that doesn't reflect on the traditions, which is what you were referring to. But I'm optimistic, and I say I'm optimistic for this reason. Many years ago, I want to say it might have been about 6, I published a book between the Kola Forest and the Salty Sea, History of Liberian People Before 1800s. It's the only scholarly book we have now that deals with that period of our history. And there was interest from academic publishers to do the book. I decided I would publish it under my own imprint to reach the Liberian audience. Because when books are published in Europe and America, oftentimes, they sell for $100 or something in that range, and they're unreachable for us. I had no idea, no experience in that regard. And that book led to the second stage of my intellectual development and education. The book was published, and I suddenly began getting invitations, come to this city where a lot of Liberians live, to talk about the book. And then the next city, and then the next city. And I began to notice a pattern. Those who were extending these invitations were Liberians who were under 40 years of age. Why? Partly because they are curious. They want to know the story. They want to know the past. They want to know about the traditions. And my peers, not so much. Many feel I already know enough, or some have grown cynical. So the youth began to expose me to a dimension I didn't know. And when I came back home, it was the same journey. The journey just expanded. We had an event, Queens at City Hall, about 115 people. And this was a one-man show, no institutional support. And the next thing I knew, hotel owners began inviting and saying, oh, we saw the first event, people are interested. The next one, 300 people filled the room. The point was not that people were buying books, but people wanted to hear about our history. And the enthusiasm of the youth is what sparked my sense of optimism. So as you were asking earlier a question about, I'm trying to remember the engagement with culture and history. Someone posed that from Scotland. And one or two other questions were related. I wanted to bring them back to that focus to say the history is rich. Unfortunate thing that I also learned in that process is that many of us do not gravitate to the mundane parts of our story, which are fascinating and empowering. We go to those areas of conflict. That's what we want to hear about, above and beyond everything else. And so the richness of our story, the fact that anthropologists used to say, oh, our people were hunters and gatherers, and yet people were engaged in international trading of Malagueta pepper, salt, and other commodities from here. We need to capture that. The youth are hungry to know, those kinds of details. And so I would just say we can broaden our lens. The story is rich. We owe it to ourselves to reclaim our uniqueness. Because we look at the food and you see how rich we are. The fact that it all comes together here and we keep winning jollof rice contests one after the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our culture is rich. Just looking at the food. Dr. Ali?
Let me conclude on the question by the last, well, not the last, but one, I think she says she's from Sinjay. Yes. She asked about the bicentennial and also asked about, we are celebrating, in her view, we're looking at our history from 1822. So what happens to the history before 1822? That's what she's asking. And I want to conclude by saying the research has been done. Dr. Burroughs talked about his work. He talks about Liberian prehistory. There are publications that have been done. I think we are partially responsible that we have now compiled this knowledge to make it available to our students in the class. That's where I think we are falling short. And Dr. Dunn alluded to that when he said, who are the historians? But even though he's not a professional historian, but he has written. So I think the onus is on us, before we leave this stage, to write our history based upon the research that has been done, because the material is there, and make it available to our students in class, in the classrooms. I recall when I returned home in 2012, there was a project to write Liberian history. And that project was headed by the Governance Commission. Dr. Dunn was one of the members of that commission. The commission had invited historians in Liberia and historians abroad to write our history. We had a 2-day meeting here. And out of that meeting, we selected topics that went it did not only include politics, because sometimes our history tends to focus on politics, government, but there are other areas of history. We call it total history, where you look at not just the actions of men, you look at the actions of women, you look at the farmers, you look at how people live, the method of entertainment. So we compile more than one volume of Liberian history. And we divided the topics, and the various authors had topics and they agreed to write. That's what Aaron alluded to. He was part of the project. In the end, the project faltered. We didn't write the Liberian history because of logistics, because of resources. So what I'm saying here is the knowledge is here. It has been produced. It's here. But the burden is on us as historians to make it available to the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ali. The knowledge is available. Our job is to produce it for the next generation. Dr. Julius Aula-Nelson initially thank the panelists and the lead presenter, and after that, the MC will come and then do small housekeeping, and then we adjourn the session.
Thank you, Anthony Norris Tuel. Let me just share briefly that the planning committee in the University of Liberia was very intentional about the attendance and participation of students. So we invited our student leaders from county, different political groups, so they are students here with us today. And even in our invitation to other institutions, higher learning, we invited them to come along to bring along students. An invitation to the Liberia National Student Union, the Federation of Liberian Youth, because we were clear in our planning that we could not have such a conference without the participation of students being a part of the exercise. The idea of launching the Center for Diaspora Studies and Migration was another way to do the afterthought. What happens after the bicentennial commemoration, and what do we do at the university that will keep the light burning with all of the interest as we move forward? And therefore, we believe that there will be something happening at the university after the bicentennial commemoration. I know from the recommendation of the History Subcommittee to the National Bicentennial Steering Committee chaired by Dr. Arling, there are activities and events that we have laid out that we must achieve during the bicentennial, and that will be accumulated into what will happen at the Center for Diaspora Studies and Migration Studies at the University of Liberia. At this time now, let me, on behalf of the Planning Committee and the University of Liberia family, express our gratitude and appreciation to Dr. Patrick Burrows, our panelists, those visually and those who are here today, for a wonderful storytelling of where we come from, where we are, and where we hope to go. I also need to express our gratitude to all of you wonderful participants that came, our partners, our guests, for honoring our invitation for day one of our activities celebrating the UL Founders Day at this international conference. I know they will be informing you about the dinner tonight, but we also hope that you'll consider coming back tomorrow so that we can see the conclusion. Tomorrow we focus on the social, economic, and monetary policies of the Republic, and we hope you will be able to come and join us as we move into day 2 of our celebration of the UL 71st anniversary as an institution of higher learning since 1951. God bless you and have a wonderful time. Congratulations for your sharing with us today.
Thank you, Mr. President. We also like to thank all of our discussants for the day. You may be retired.